Saturday. I just want to make sure I am live, and it looks like I am. I think, maybe. I have a love-hate relationship with delay on YouTube, so I think we're live, but if we're not, I would like to know earlier than later. Yes. Awesome. Okay. Very cool. We are live. Woo! Now that we have that scheduled, squared away, this is actually not even a month in our block of the month. We are actually doing the quilt top assembly. So typically I like to do this the month after we finished all 6 months of making our blocks. And to remind you, this is the quilt top. You can see a bigger picture here. That is the quilt that we're making. It's Wish. It is using Morris Mist fabric from Island Batik. And yeah, we have made all of our blocks. If you're just now joining us and you're like, hey, I really want to make this quilt, awesome. Links below for the pattern and quilt kits if there's any left. And that will give you enough fabric to make the entire quilt top with a white background like I'm making here on stream. The original quilt had an almond, had a blender, but I decided to make it with white this time. All right, so a couple things to note. In the pattern, I do tell you which month and which block to use for the quilt top assembly. So I'll say things like month 1 block A, month 2 block B, or something like that. I'm not actually reading it, but something like that. So if you go through and labeled all your blocks, right, with either painter's tape or something like that, it's pretty easy for you to pick out the blocks that you want. The other option is just to look at the picture. All right, so you have little bit of images of your blocks that you're supposed to do. This quilt top is made in essentially, I would say 5 rows. So you have row 1, row 2, the center row, and then row 2 and row 1. All right, so that's 5 total. So you're making 2 row 1s, 2 row 2s, and then your center portion of the block, the quilt, I mean. So for row 1, this is at the very top left of the quilt. You're gonna start with this block here, then this one, this, and this one. And essentially, if you look at it, it's this whole section mirrored on the other side. So it's going to be 1, 2, 3, 3, 2, 1. So I'm going to make 4 of these. And in this case, I'm only going to make 1. And I already have 1 pre-made that we're going to sew together to make the first big row. But something to note about orientation of your blocks. So you see this kind of fabric here. And I actually don't even remember which one that one was now. Let me double check. That was fabric A. All right. So fabric A is kind of the identifier on all of your blocks. So in this first row, fabric A should be touching your fabric A here. The nice thing is this block, if you rotate it, it's the same. This block, you rotate it, it's the same. Block 3, so 1, 2, 3 is not, right? So you either have background or fabric A. You want to make sure fabric A is touching that block in 2, and fabric A is going to touch fabric A of the 3 that's coming over. So what we're going to go ahead and do, now that this is laid out correctly, is we're going to sew these seams together. And given how you pressed your seams, right, so you have either seams that go in or out depending on the way you press them. These all go out. And then these all, I think, went in, but I don't remember. Nope, these went in and out. So you can go ahead and essentially align the seams the way you want to nest. If you weren't consistent on how you pressed all your seams, you will have clashing seams. Just make sure you pin and are a little careful as you're sewing through those areas. Otherwise, if you pressed all your seams open, you're going to be like, ha, suckers for everyone who pressed them to the side. You're going to have to do a little bit of finagling to make sure that your seams nest, or to have the least number of seams clash. All right? Okay. So I am am going to go ahead, these go in, these go out, and I'm going to go ahead and sew this seam together here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to essentially use my fork pins to pin my seams together. And I'm going to do that on the machine camera here. I use fork pins, especially when we have seams that nest. So essentially, we're going to nest that seam together. And then we're going to pin on either side of that seam. This actually helps the seams not move. You got to, flip up and down to make sure that this little flapper on this side of that seam doesn't sew vent or underneath. You want to make sure it sews flat through the machine. But other than that, the seam itself won't move. So I'm going to do that for the other side as well. So now we're going to take this and sew all the way down. Fork pins out, and I have now blocks 1 and 2 sewn together like so. I'm going to go ahead and add this third block over, and what I'm not going to do right now is press these block seams. I will do that once we get rows 1 and 2 sewn together to make sure that I know which direction I want to sew these block seams. Because unlike the individual unit seams that you did when you mass made these in the different months, this one here, you have at least some level of control of which direction you want to press your seams. So when you sew your rows together, at least the block seams will nest versus having a whole bunch of clashing seams. All right. So we're going to add this block over to this one, and we're going to do the same thing and nest our seams as best as I can and pin with fork pins. Even if your seams don't nest, I still use fork pins in this case, really just to make sure that my fabric doesn't move. Having a pin on either side of that seam allowance really helps the fabric not move when it's going through the machine. So like I said, you'll have, this way. You'll have 4 of these, right? So, ta-da, you'll have 4 because you'll have 2 for the top border, 2 for the bottom border. So with, some movie magic sped up, we have made another one. Ta-da! Fantastic, right? So what we're going to do to make our full row, if you notice, we had blocks 1, 2, 3. Notice they have their own names in the pattern, but it's going to be what it is. And then this is going to be 3, 2, 1 on this side. And we're going to sew these together, okay? And one thing I will note, I did have clashing seams on here, and I'll show you what I did to mitigate those. We're going to put these right sides together, and we're going to pin. And what you're going to see here is that this center unit, these seams go in towards that center unit. These seams go in, so all of my seams are in the middle, and that's okay. I am also going to try to pin as best as I can for some of these on my 4-patch, like this one nests. I'm going to pin that one here. I know these clash, but I'm going to hold that where the seam is supposed to be, and that's okay, and I'm just going to pin it on either side. Some folks really hate this, so I'm really sorry. You can go back and you can go and press that seam open as far as you can, etc. But for me, I'm using batik fabrics. I feel like it is fine. It will press flat enough for me to quilt. And then these also clash, but that's okay. So I'm just going to pin it. So, disclaimer at the the beginning of the pattern that says, if you don't like clashing seams, ever, go ahead and press all your seams open. One thing I am doing at the start and stop of every like block assembly or block sewing together like this is I am back stitching. After I get the whole quilt top together, what I will do is I will do a 1/8 inch sew, I guess, seam sew, like just sew in a straight line on a single piece of fabric all the way around the quilt to make sure that my edges don't pop. So I don't have any seams that pop. I know I don't backstitch all the time, and so if you don't, you have the ability to have a seam split. So I go and stitch all the way around. I call it a victory lap because Krista Watson calls it a victory lap, but I don't know. Other people call it different things. Okay, so this is now row 1. You're going to make 2 of these, and you're going to set them aside until you finish your second row. Okay, because then that's when you're going to be able to go and press your seams in the way that you want. All right, for our second row, you can't actually do it the way you did row 1, because if you split that row in half, or even the 2 side blocks, it's not identical. Sorry, they're not. So you're going to have to sew the row from right to left or left to right, depending on how you want to do it, but you want to sew the row in one piece, and you can make both of them at the same time. I'm just going to demo making one. The other thing you're going to need for row 2 is these little rectangles. These are the solid rectangles that you should have had left from month 6 that you cut out. They are done for the quilt top assembly. They did not get used in month 6, okay? So you should have 4 of these, 2 for each row. All right. So I'm going to set this up, how we're going to make this quilt top, okay? These star and a star, fabric A is only on half of that quilt block, right? So you don't have it here, you have them here and not here. They're not on opposite sides, they're on adjacent sides. When you're sewing this together, the fabric A needs to go facing the same way on the row. You can make it face down like this, where you're touching one side with that first block and one side touching row 1, or you can make it like this, okay? Meaning you have block 1 in this row, block 2, you have your blank, this one, and then on the other side, you're gonna have to do it this way, okay? Does that make sense? So there's blocks in the middle of this, but I want to be able to show you guys what we do on stream, right? So we have fabric A touching the blocks on the first and the last block, and then these corners need to be in the same direction, okay? If you have it done going this way, you're going to break that image because this fabric A doesn't have anything below it to attach to. It has to be on the same side as row 1. That's why you can't make these, you can't sew all 4 of these blocks in this direction and call it good, okay? So we're just going to add one by one what this is going to look like, because it's going to be block 1, block 2, then you add a rectangle like so, okay? Then you add a block, a rectangle, this block, and then the last block, right? So this is going to be a mirror, not a make 2, flip 180, and sew together. Okay, so like so, we are now going to flip these together. We're going to pin our seams again and sew them together. So in this case, our fabric A is going to be at the top. Okay. Sorry, I pinned these seams in my lap. It's out of habit. It just doesn't happen to be on stream. So there we go. Seam on the bottom lays flat. Oops. Okay. this case, I'm just going to pop that open, cut it. I'm going to open this here, right, like so. And the next piece that I'm going to sew is my solid rectangle. I'm actually going to take this stack because I'm going to essentially continually add to it. Okay. We have that. We're going to take our solid piece that looks like so. Open this. We're going to add month 6 block. Okay. Now we add our blank rectangle again. Pretty much it's to center our little month 6 block around our piece in the middle. But because it's a rectangle and not a square, we needed to mount that a little bit differently. Now we're going to add our piece that has our fabric A. So fabric A needs to go up and then to the last piece. You want to make sure that that orientation is correct before you sew this down. And then I'm going to add the last piece on. And then this one here I am going to pin again. Okay, so now we have all of row 2. Now how you press this is up to you. I typically like to have my seams pressed towards the solid piece just because that makes it a little bit easier. And then on this top piece, I want to press away from all this white. So I press towards that direction and then that's it, right? So up, away from this second piece, away from this one to go to the solids, away from the second piece and towards the outside. So now that I know that, that means my row 1 then needs to go towards this second piece, right? Towards the second block, towards the 5th block, and then between 3 and 4 it could be whatever you want because that's going to land in the middle of that second row. So as my iron heats up, I'm going to go ahead and press my blocks. What you're going to do here is you're going to make 2 row 1s and 2 row 2s, and you're going to make the same thing, right? You're going to have 2 of the identical things. And then you're going to sew them together, and you got to make sure you sew them together on the correct side, right? So we were very careful about that second to last and second block to have the fabric A point towards the same direction. Row 1 needs to sew on the side that fabric A is on. Okay. Otherwise, you're going to be very weird. You're going to look at your quilt top and be like, that doesn't look right. Like you got some triangles floating in the middle of nowhere at that point. That's why we did that for fabric A. Do you see kind of how that darker color now transitions block to block and it looks like they were meant to be? That happens with row 1 attaching up here too. So let me iron the other piece and I will show you what I mean. All right, so row one, either direction works. So what happens is here. So these attach here. Do you see how now fabric A looks like you made a little bit of a ribbon, and then this makes a square. If you didn't have it this way, and you had it the other way, like something like that, you'll see how you have that broken piece here. This will look okay, but then you have the triangle floating in the middle of nowhere towards the center of the quilt. All right, so these two now are going to go right sides together, and you're gonna go, okay, I'm gonna be happy that my pieces that I did for my blocks will nest. Now my units may or may not nest, and this is when you go, I'm gonna be happy if some of them nest, or, you know, all of them nest. We might get lucky, who knows? So, there we go. I am going to be, it's like a surprise when I've done this. I think there might be a way to do all in, all out, but there's going to be like a level of clashing regardless sometimes, just because of the way, like for example, the middle blocks happen. You're just not going to be able to get everything in and out correctly, so you do your best. But we are pretty darn close to having no clashing seams. It's really exciting. A lot of times when I do alternating in outs for my blocks, I get pretty darn close. Now you're probably like, okay, so now what? You've done 2 blocks. We have this random thing here. That doesn't really fit anything. But my center units, yes, my center block, like my blocks, doesn't have one, but I have a center unit that may match the center unit of the center block. So I'm going to go ahead and pin that one too. Like this one nests, this one clashes, but that's okay. So I'm going to go ahead and just pin that one still correctly here. And then I know I'm going to skip, you know, this one here. Oops, not that one. I'm going to skip this one here on the bottom. And then this one where our seams nest with another unit. I'm essentially pinning as much as I can every single time a unit is supposed to nest or clash, and where the blocks are as well. So kind of nice to be able to utilize all of this. Like so. Yep, and then for some odd reason, the other side nested fine, this side doesn't. So it's kind of a hit or miss. This side clashed, the one on the other side nested. I could have just pressed my seams a little funky on one or two of the blocks, but here you go. And then now, we are going to go ahead and sew the long seam together. With fork pins, I do sew over them, but if you notice, I do take a little bit of a pause and I slow down while I sew over the pins themselves. The pins are fairly thin and you can sew over them. They will, however, break your needle or throw your machine at a time if you hit it very fast. If you hit them slowly, the needle will slide over the pin and then it's fine, but if you hit it going like jackrabbit speed on your machine, it's very scary. So slow down when you come to a pin. I'm going to take the pins out and we're going to press all of our seams, and I think it doesn't matter which direction you press them. Honestly, you can press them towards row 1 or row 2. It doesn't matter. I think I pressed mine originally to row 1 just because there's more like darker fabrics on row 1. So if you flip this over and look at row 2, you get big swaths of white. So I think I pressed towards row 1 just because of that. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and do that real quick. And what you're going to do, you're going to make 2 of these, right? So we talked about making 2 row 1s, 2 row 2s. You're going to make 2 of these row 1 plus row 2 rectangles. All right? Because this is going to be the top and the bottom of the quilt once it's all said and done. And they are identical, so make 2 of them. The next section that we're going to be working on is essentially row 3 of the quilt. If you're talking row 1, row 2, row 3. Row 3 has 6 of the blocks plus month 5's really, really big month 5 block or rectangle. And the 6 blocks that we add to month 5 is 3 on either side of month 5 to make a big rectangle. Okay? So this is 1 and 2. We're going to put that aside for now. Over here. The 3 blocks that we show are going to be a month 6 and 2 month 3 blocks. I had to go look at what these month 3 blocks were. Again, you can either have labeled your blocks or you can just look at the image and match the block with the correct block, okay? Month 3, fun fact, you have also another fabric A, okay? Month 6 sits between your 2 month 3 blocks. And one of the things you need to notice is your fabric A's are going to be the long ways. They're going to be on the outside of this rectangle that you're making. So fabric A, and I know you can't see them on that side, but if you scroll over, scoot these over, fabric A. So they're going to be in line with that quilt, or these 3 blocks. All right, so we're now going to sew this together. And the fun fact about this is, guess what? None of these seams match. So just make sure your blocks start and stop at the same time. Make sure you're not pulling the block through the machine. And we're just going to sew here and sew here to make a rectangle. Okay? And similar to what we did for rows 1 and 2, we aren't going to press our seams until we match it up with the center month 5 to make sure that we can at least nest these blocks with that center piece. All right, so we have those sewn together. We're going to open this up, and then we're going to add in the other month 3. You are also going to make 2 of these vertical blocks, and this goes on the left and the right side of month 5. So you can kind of see where that falls, right? With the quilt top right here. And before we iron these, we're going to want to look at how that fits in with month 5. Okay, so month 5. I already sewed one of the sides on because you didn't need me to do it twice. But we're going to look and make sure it matches with this side of month 5. And the way to do that is you're going to put the pieces pretty close to each other and say, okay, what direction did my seams go in this case? This one goes down. This one also goes down. So pretty much, as long as the seams for this one go in the same direction, it doesn't matter because this is identical 180 degrees from each other. Make sense? All right. I'm going to iron these seams. Some of these aren't doing the best. Let me flip that over because I got a couple pointy corners that didn't like to iron there. Okay. All right. So we have those. Then now I'm going to go right sides together with month 5 and make sure, yep, that one nests. That one nests. Perfect. So now we're going to go ahead and pin these 2 here and sew them down. The interesting thing is, how do you think we're going to determine which way we press this block? We're going to determine this based off of where that row 2, blocks 1 and 2 in row 2 got pressed. So they should be identical to that. Otherwise, this is the one that you can fix. You can't really fix row 2 anymore because it's sewn to row 1 already. This is kind of how I personally handle determining which way I press my seams during quilt top assembly, is literally how does everything fit together ultimately, right? It's not I'm going to press everything and then just hope and whatnot. I have some bit of thought as I'm doing the quilt top assembly which way I want to press my seam. If you decided to flip directions and didn't follow the same thing I did, then your seams will go in a different direction than mine. It doesn't really matter, honestly. Left, right, center, you can make your own pick. You'll just want to double check that your seams nest the way that you would like them in your quilt. For me, specifically, I will press towards month 5 because my blocks on month 2 are pressing towards that first and last block, if that makes sense. I'm going to go double check here. My seams are nested and it looks fine. So I am going to go ahead and press towards month 5 and away from these 3 blocks that I just sewn onto the quilt. Whole center done, right? Because I already sewed the first other side as well, right? So both sides of month 5. This is the center of the quilt. And then we're going to take one of the rows 1 and 2 that we sewed. Okay? We're going to do that. Make sure that it's row 2 that is sewing to the middle. And we're going to pin this together. I'm going to take the pins over here again and sew it. We're going to do this to both sides of the center, right? So we have 2 rows 1 and 2. And that center row, we're going to pin them, we're going to sew them, and then we're going to press them. And honestly, in this direction, or in this case, pressing rows 2 between rows 2 and 3 on your quilt doesn't really matter, right? Because there's nothing else that it's trying to align to. You will potentially have some things that clash. So in this case, I do have a clashy seam here. So I'm going to go ahead and just pin it and be okay with that. Nothing here. And then I have a clashy seam here. Apparently, I thought I was going to press the other direction when I sewed all this, so it's okay. Then I have a matching seam that will be here. All right, so now I'm going to sew rows 1, 2, and 3 together on one side. We're going to press, and then we're going to add rows 1 and 2 to the other side to finish off the quilt top. the longest part that doesn't have a seam or doesn't have a pin. So you'll want to make sure you align kind of where you know seams are going to align. So this seam is going to be at the point of this flying geese. So I'm looking at this going like, you know, there's nothing to align there, but I'm just going to wash it and hold it with my hand. Really, the next one is that next space because there's nothing else that aligns here. So you just kind of want to make sure that your seam is fairly straight between the two blocks. If your blocks are different sizes or slightly off, this is kind of where you can finagle in your seam allowances to make your blocks fit appropriately. Seam. We're going to keep going. Rows and together. All right, I'm going to take the pins out here, and then we're going to go ahead and press this seam before we add the other row in. And here's where, again, I will take a look and say, all right, which way am I pressing it? Is it going to be top or bottom? And honestly, I'm probably just going to press out towards 1 and 2 just because it's sometimes a little easier to do it that way. We have about the same dark and light fabric on either side, so we're just going to do that. Okay. So if you want to pause the video, if you're watching this later, and not live, and go make your other rows, that would be ideal, right? And then come back, and you can watch the rest of it or something like that. But we're going to do this exact same thing that we did by sewing rows 1 and 2 to the other side of the quilt top to finish out the quilt. Okay? Because right now we have rows 1, 2, and 3. Technically, we need a 1, 2, or 2, 1 at the bottom, or 4, 5, depending on how you're going to call it, for the quilt top. Okay? So, happen to have another rows 1 and 2 that we're going to add on, and you're going to make sure that it's row 2 adding on to the center piece. Okay? Like so. So then now, we're going to go ahead and pin this like we just did and sew it again. Great. Okay. Again, row 2 pinning to row 3. There's again not a lot of places where this quilt could be pinned, so I'm going to pin at the block intersections. You can theoretically pin at the end as well, so some folks like to do that. Even though there's nothing here, use a fork pin to pin that together so the ends don't run away. We have a little bit of a clashy seam here, but that's okay. I'm going to pin that as well. And then what gets interesting is this space, there's really nothing here, and this is what I talked about, right? So you have this seam here that will hit your flying geese. Theoretically, you can pin here even though there's not a seam to pin, but that way you have that. And then you have a seam here that's going to hit your flying geese as well on this side. And we're going to hit that like so. before we are here to go this way, and then pin here, like so. So now we're going to sew this all together. Redo that because my seam I lost my seam going through that. It went crooked, so I'm gonna there we go. I will say it's a little tricky to start seams over like that if you are pressing open, but because this is like one of the last seams that we're doing that we're just pressing straight, it's not really worrisome. You're just going to continue going and press it to one direction and call it good. So I'm not too super worried about having to fix that any way other than just pressing that seam when we're done. We're going to do a quick press for this seam and our quilt top is done. Now, if you're going to be sending your quilt top to a long armor, or if you're going to maybe quilt this yourself, best practice for any of the quilt tops that I do, and maybe something that you should think about, is doing what we call a victory lap. I kind of mentioned this earlier in the stream about sewing all the way around the edge of your quilt top with an 1/8 of an inch seam allowance, just with one piece of fabric, right? Like you don't need to add another piece of fabric. You're just sewing all the way around. And what that does is that secures any of your edges. So in case, you're like me and are not great at remembering the back stitch for everything, it means all your fabric pretty much won't escape as you're tugging and pulling through the machine for quilting, or as your long armor is loading on the machine. I typically request that anybody who sends me quilts, as I do long arm for other folks, to do a lap like that around their quilt top, and really it just makes sure that they don't have any busted seams in their quilt, like anything that separates by accident. All right. So there we have it. We have our finished quilt top, and I know you can't see everything, but it's there. Ta-da! This quilt finished at 72 by 84, or finishes at 72 by 84. It is a very, very fun quilt. I Love how it turned out. Actually, I like to see if I can't fold it up a little bit to put it up in a bit, but I hope you enjoyed this series for the Wish Block of the Month. If you enjoyed this series, this quilt difficulty probably ranks, I would say in the middle of the things that I have done in the past. So on YouTube, you will be able to find Wave Pool, Summer Delight, Wish, and then now we're actually in the middle of Love Letter. There are 2 other quilt tops that I have made that are big bombs like this, which are Barn Quilt Block of the Month and Lucky Stars Block of the Month. However, those videos are on my Facebook group, which at some point I need to export and put on here. But those are a long time ago. Other than that, I think that's it for today for Wish. We're going to do a quick, maybe like 9-minute break, and then we'll be right back live with our Love Letter month 4. If you're interested in the pattern and whatnot, then links are below. I think that's it for Wish, and we're going to sign off, and we will see you back at 1 o'clock Central for Love Letter. Have a great day!